Welcome to Spirit of the Midwest, a show featuring interviews and stories that expose the deep values and pride found in the heart of America. My name is C.K. Hicks, and I'm here today with my co-host, Wesley Noble.
And we are here today with Danielle Evans. Danielle is a food typographer, meaning that she actually gets to play with food for a living. I mean, how cool is that? Super excited to have you, Danielle.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, super excited to talk with you. A good, kind of starting out question is just kind of your story and how you got started. Maybe even some of your background, like where you were born and how you got to where you are today.
Oh my goodness.
It's huge, I know.
I was raised. No. Well, actually, I was born in New Jersey, of all places, but I didn't stay there very long. I've spent almost my entire life in Ohio. I was, I guess, raised is the right term, in Steubenville, whose major export is like football and rape cases.
Oh, man.
So that's most unfortunate. But it's this tiny little blue-collar town that was a bustling steel town, like the 40s, 50s, and sort of 60s, until the industry started to tank and go overseas. Because of that, the town shrank quite a bit. So around middle school, I moved up to Canton, which their major export is also football. So I'm noticing a pattern. But I found that Canton is this really fascinating place. It's like this incubator for creative people. And I don't know if it's because there's just enough snow that we don't know how to function. I don't know if it's just a giant suburb, really. And so there's not much to do or be distracted by. So I wonder if that kind of fuels the creative process for people. But I mean, really, there is kind of where I started tapping into my interest in art. And I went to school out in Indiana, which, again, there was nothing there. It was basically a cornfield, a Walmart, and somehow they figured out how to grow a ghetto in the middle of nowhere. So, I mean, there was nothing to do in this town except to really push myself and kind of fold into my studies. And I couldn't decide when I was in school exactly what I wanted to do. Like, I knew I was really attracted to drawing, and I had been for years, like even as a little kid. And in school, I found this conundrum where I was so attracted to the idea of telling stories and illustration, but I was also inexplicably drawn to design and order and type. I thought those things were magical, and I couldn't figure out how to marry them, and I felt like I never fully fit in either world, and I was just straddling these two borders, I guess. So I knuckled down. I graduated with an illustration degree, and I happened to graduate right into the middle of the housing market. So it was nearly impossible the year before people started struggling to find work. And so everyone just went, well, hope this is over before you get out of here.
Yeah.
Good luck. And because of that, I ended up struggling a lot. Because I didn't know where exactly I fit, it was hard to articulate this to employers, and I couldn't find work. So I worked in a restaurant, and I worked in retail, and I cried a lot, and probably would have drank a lot if I could have afforded it, but I couldn't. So,
oh man,
just chocolate milk for me. But
that's great.
Yeah, so I mean, it's funny. Like, I gave a talk recently in Memphis where I kind of rehashed my tale of woe, and it's funny when I look back on how embarrassingly raw and awful like my story is, just with all the failures and ceasing to make certain connections. It's funny because that has really fueled my work, and it has fueled how I've started doing this food typography thing. Essentially, I turned to this idea because I didn't have the money for supplies, and that had been a constant problem for me all the way through school. I barely afforded to go to school and barely graduated because I still had outstanding bills my last semester. And so looking around and trying to figure out how to do work that I thought would be fascinating and interesting, I first of all realized that people wanted multi-sensory experiences with their work. And most designers strictly stay in the realm of visual appeal. But I noted that some of the particularly interesting ones really cared about touch and visual aesthetics, or smell and visual aesthetics. In order to be somewhat competitive, my work needed to invoke something additionally. And so I started searching for what that was, and I was deeply inspired by the lickable wallpaper that was out at the time. I was inspired by this book of guidelines that had a weight in the spine. It won an FPO award because it had gravitas, like literal weight, to this book of ethics. It was so smart. And in searching for these things, I thought, like, I was articulating to a friend who's not creative traditionally what my work needed, and I likened it to a cup of coffee. And I told her that it was basically like drinking a cup of coffee, where you have heat from the cup and you have smell and you have the texture of the milk or the foam. And it's not just consuming a beverage, you're having an experience, and a well-rounded one. And I wanted people to have that when they looked at my work.
Yeah.
And in that moment, she was like, well, why don't you just do something out of coffee? That sounds like a great idea. Clearly misunderstanding me, but I went, you know what, that's a really great idea. Let's do that. So that's kind of where it all started, and it became a way for me to pull away from the computer and to make very calculated decisions, but at the same time more impulsive. So I was following my intuition, and I think that was kind of the sweet spot that I needed to hit with my work. And people started really enjoying it, so I continued to make more, and here I am a couple years later with a career, and this is what I do. It's crazy.
That's so fascinating, and I love the way you say your friend was not creative traditionally, because obviously, you know, all problem solving requires some amount of creativity, but there are some things that are just you do them and you're like, wow, that person is so creative, because like you take food and you make messages to people, and it just, and that I love how that aspect of creativity just bubbles up out of kind of necessity. Like, you're trying to figure out how to express yourself, you're trying to figure out how to bootstrap your take the things that you're passionate about and do something with them. And so your friend goes, well, why don't you just do this? And it's like, oh, well, I guess I could do it that way. And then all of a sudden you know, like, food typography is born. So that's such a fascinating story.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I absolutely love that story. I really want to ask though, what was it like? What did it feel like being in that point where you were working as a waitress and just trying to make ends meet and like scrimping stuff together, but you knew that you wanted to do something more?
Oh man, that was hard. It was really hard. I remember feeling really low. Like I couldn't conceive of the fact that someone would ever want to hire me for what I went to school for. Like, the reality of that kind of set in. And I would get really frustrated because there's a certain way that people treat other people in food service. Mm-hmm. And they treat you like an idiot. They act almost in some cases like you're a subhuman or you are a fixture in their day. And if you are not in that exact spot, being that exact fixture that they, you know, hope to see, then they question that.
Yeah.
And so it was hard looking at the people that I was surrounded by, realizing that a lot of them were like me. They were educated individuals. They had bigger plans for their lives. They wanted to go somewhere else. And then there were people who didn't want any of those things. This was their career. And in some cases that was great. And in others you were like, wow, this is really disappointing. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, that part was very difficult. And I remember I had to it took me 3 years to work up the courage to tell people that I did design at all. And once I became comfortable with that, I told somebody every single day. And then I told every single person, because I wanted a chance to get out of that life. But I mean, it's fascinating because the things that I did, the working as a waitress, the working in retail, I sold shoes for DSW and I worked at the Container Store. And I would say that the latter really enforced rules like selling. That was something that I hadn't really had a whole lot of experience doing. And I found that their technique for selling is very soft. They basically show people, they suggest to people how their work or their products are valuable. Mm-hmm. And I hadn't really been shown how to do that. I hadn't been shown how to like articulate to a stranger, this is something that I believe in, and here's some way that it can benefit you. And so while both of those, like all three of those experiences were very difficult for me, I can say I took something away from them, and I took something I took something helpful away from them that I still use today. So that's a
Uh,
cool concept.
Yeah, well, and one of the things that we talk about when we're asking people like kind of their story or things that influence them is how would you describe or how has the Midwest influenced you? And it sounds like in this case, because you grew up, like you said, in kind of a blue collar town, there was a lot of you were kind of, you felt stuck in the food industry and the service industry. And so you get to a point where you're like, the only way I'm going to get out of this is if I start talking to people about what I would really like to do, and seeing the people around you who some of them just did not have a plan or didn't have anything they were really shooting for. That really, you kind of, it sounds like you kind of looked at some of them and just went, I don't want to do that. I don't know exactly what I need to do yet, but I know it's not this. And so
Yes.
I'm just going to tell everybody what I'm interested in, and someone will recommend something. And then ultimately you had someone say, well, why don't you just use the coffee then? And then it was, oh, well, sure. That sounds, well, I guess I could try that. And then all of a sudden, boom, you have this, you're creating messages through food. So so did you actually, I'm dying to know, did you actually get your start in food typography with materials from your time at the diner, or was that something you started on your own, kind of like in your kitchen?
That was something I started on my own in my kitchen. It's funny, I had originally, when I went back and started looking through my work to show in a presentation, I realized that my first piece in which I had done this was actually with tape. It was measuring tape. And I had done it for my new portfolio once I had decided that, oh man, I want to focus on lettering. Lettering is really important to me. And so I remember doing it and going, this is awful, gross, and I cast it aside. But 4 months later, when I had this conversation with my friend, I went, well, food makes a lot of sense to me for whatever reason, so let's go with that. So I chose materials out of my house because I thought, well, things are pretty dire right now. If something should happen where I need to eat this later, I totally can and don't know the difference.
Oh my goodness.
But
That's great.
It was funny because apparently I don't do anything without a little bit of dramatic flair. Or just, I don't know, I must just go down in flames really epically. Right before I decided to start doing this, it was actually about 3 years ago, around Christmas. I had been stiffed on a freelance job that I was trying to do. And that was all of our Christmas money. That was part of our rent. We were in trouble. And so in talking with my husband, we decided that we weren't going to have Christmas that year, that we were just going to hang out. And I got really stressed out from knowing this and not being able to collect on my bill, that I got this rash. It was almost like an allergic reaction, and it creeped up my body. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't function. I couldn't get more work because I just couldn't speak to anybody. I had an interview and I just remember blanking out in the middle of it, and there were 30 seconds of dead air where I just couldn't think of words. I couldn't start phrases, and I just remember being miserable. And I tell people, most pathetically, I was sitting in a bathtub covered in oatmeal trying to not be itchy, and my husband's sitting there, and I'm just like, tell me it's going to get better. And he goes, I think it will.
Yeah.
That's super confident of you. Tell me it's going to get better. Please mean it. And he's like, It will. I just can't tell you when. And it was in that moment of despair when I went, I really want to I want to do things that I'm proud of, and I want to feel like I can do the work that I want to do. I hadn't felt since getting out of school, or even in school really, that I could ever do the work I thought was important or valuable. And I was like, this might not make me any money. Do I have permission to pursue this wholeheartedly? And he was like, as long as you're happier than you are right now, I don't care what you do.
Well, what a blessing to have someone, particularly a spouse, but people who would look at you and be like, you know what, you're gonna make it. It's all right. I mean, I have to imagine that just made all the difference in the world.
It really did. It's hard sometimes because when you're dealing with this on a daily basis, you look at everything kind of unfolding before you and it's not coming together, and it's despair-inducing, and it wrecks a person. No one likes to be failing on a daily basis, and I think it's easy to get lost in that and allow it to paralyze you. And I think that that's kind of where I was, in this perpetual state of just despair and not being able to catch or continuing to spin my wheels. And I think having someone looking outside of me going, you know what, you're all right, and you're going to be all right, and you're going to be more all right than you know. That really,
That's fantastic.
Really, and so when I can, I'm trying to like pay that forward to people, because it's hard. It's really hard, and it just takes someone believing in you, you know.
Yeah. So what then was the breakthrough for you?
Oh my goodness, it's so funny, because there was not like a large breakthrough. There were a ton of small ones, and I remember, like, as I had these small paradigm shifts, I realized that I was moving towards something. I just didn't know what it was. Like, months before my career technically started, I remember saying, like, I have a feeling that this is something good is going to happen. And that was like the last possible step. Like, I remember maybe the first one would be not comparing myself to other people. I remember that moment when I could suddenly feel excited for somebody who had something good happen in their life with their career, and I didn't feel like it was robbing me of anything. You know, I felt like they were on their journey, and they were now steps into their journey, and I could feel excited for them because I would not experience those same things. That was not my experience to have.
Sure.
I think maybe after that, feeling confident in my work, realizing that I was still growing and being okay with that, and realizing that while I was exploring lettering, I didn't necessarily like my projects, or I didn't necessarily feel like I had executed them very well, and so I would resurrect old ones and try to jazz them up and make them look more appealing or appropriate to my sensibilities if the idea was still a good one. And I realized that once I started doing that, I wanted to show my work. And so I started, I don't know, posting my URL, which can help a person get work occasionally. You know. And I think finally the culmination of this moment for me was maybe realizing that my attitude directed much of my experience, and realizing that I could be really freaked out about this all the time, but clearly it got me nowhere being upset about it. And not sleeping obviously had not helped me either.
Yeah, that does help.
Yeah, so I think like just realizing that my attitude had to be one of openness and not expectation, but just the realization that if I continue to push through, something good is going to happen. And so starting to put my work online, which I hadn't felt comfortable really to do before, I started posting it regularly, and because it was so different, it was getting this really wonderful response, first on Dribbble, then on Twitter, on Tumblr, and I just started populating it across the web, and other people that I didn't know who enjoyed what I was doing was enough to fuel me to go, you know what, this has legs, let's keep moving with it, and let's keep experimenting.
Yeah.
It was exciting because in a lot of ways it became like a community idea where other people were feeding in, like, oh, try this or do that, or yeah, it was great. So I mean, that started it, and the connection point, I think, was landing my first big client. So that was exciting.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. And so, you mentioned the community aspect of it, and the first place that I learned about you actually was this last year at Circles. And when you gave a presentation there, and then I see you're on the roster for next year also. So, you're a great speaker, but it was amazing to see how the people reacted when you were showing examples of your work and you're telling little bits and pieces of your history and stuff. And everyone's going, "Oh, that's so cool!" Just getting it out in the open. It's amazing what that brings to the table. Yeah,
it's true. I believe we had talked about starting the conversation and how creativity in making art, you're kind of making a visual marker to a certain chain of thought. Your artwork is almost like a snapshot of a thought you were having at one moment, and it's like a visual representation of that thought. And so in order to add to the conversation, the artwork that you make has to evolve, and the artwork that people make similarly to yours has to evolve beyond your initial thought, or it's an old thought and it's not original anymore. And I think that that aspect of now there's almost this community movement in this idea is really empowering and humbling and just incredible. To be perfectly honest, I can't believe that people want this. I can't believe that companies want work like this. It's mind-boggling, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah.
That is so cool. Kind of moving on to more of a Midwest discussion.
Oh, please.
How would you describe the Midwest to someone who has not been here?
Oh man, I love having this conversation with people.
That's great. That's why we picked you.
Yes. Well, I've had this conversation most notably with Brandon Reich, another illustrator and designer from Columbus, where I currently live. And he and I have discussed, like, the Midwest is just rife with this blue collar mentality. Like, where I came from is very close to Pittsburgh, essentially. It's right on the cusp of 3 states, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. Mm-hmm. And the immigrant population that had moved to those areas and started populating those areas is still fresh. Like, my grandfather came here from Italy. So, like, that attachment to the old world and old world ethic is still very strong. And I think you can almost see, like, these very obvious ethnic groups kind of working hard together. A lot of them worked in steel mills or paper plants or things that were located on bodies of water, and they worked long, hard days. And I think that while it may have distilled a little bit over time, dissipated a little bit over time, I think that working hard, digging in, getting the job done is still very, very apparent. I've gone on shoots around the country and around the world, and people have remarked, saying, like, when we meet people from the Midwest, we know because they know how to work and they take pride in their work. And I think there's this beautiful, like, industrial, like, post-industrial kind of mentality that still exists here. And I think that's in part why we produce so many interesting artists and musicians and various people that choose to do things, because they come from this part of the country where maybe, like, geographically there's not a lot of distraction, or there's not a lot of, like, general interesting things going on, and so they learn to cultivate themselves. And so there's a lack of pretense. It's very honest and very open, and I think being friendly and warm it endears us to other people from other places that aren't used to that. So
well, and I think part of your story where you're talking about the like we said earlier, where you were in the diner and you're kind of thinking, well, what am I going to do the thing that I'm really trying to get to, whatever that looks like, whatever that is. But your result was, well, I just need to keep trying it. I need to keep going and keep doing, and the Midwest has this tradition of breeding sort of this hardiness in people.
Yes.
And being able to say, you know what? Yeah, maybe I don't have access to these other things that would make this easier, or maybe I don't have the biggest crowd of people who think the exact same way that I do, or whatever. But darn it, I'm gonna try and figure out what to do with this. And you have to, otherwise you just do the same thing forever. And so, and there are people who they find their one thing and they can just do it peacefully because there's, like you said, less distraction. And so I mean, I think your story is a really great sort of an iconic Midwest story, because it's sort of the girl who made good, growing up in the Midwest and kind of feeling crushed under the monotony or even just the simplicity of it. And you're saying, I want to do something that's so close to this, but it's not here. So I gotta find it, and you didn't travel to a far country and, or whatever else. You just got down and got to work and you took pride in it. So that's really cool.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's a fascinating idea. I feel like also the Midwest is a place that people have beginnings. Most people that flock to the coast or just move somewhere else, like, it's to start anew or to start fresh, and they can be whoever that it is that they want to be in that moment. Like, traditionally, people escape to the West, for example, in order to forget themselves or to start anew. And therefore, they've bred this, like, rough and tumble kind of mentality. But here, it's where people are comfortable having a story, and most people that come from here are happy carrying their beginnings to wherever it is that they go.
That's a great quote.
Thanks. Put that on a t-shirt.
Yeah, I was just listening to that. Like, that's fantastic. Write that down.
So, yeah, I think I think living in the Midwest can make you a better person if you choose to kind of rise above if you choose to work hard and kind of rise above some of the stuff, some of the opportunities that aren't just handed to you in your lap. But I mean, we've kind of talked about it, but how would you say that the Midwest has kind of shaped you?
Oh man. Well, it's funny. I've lived across several states now. I forgot to mention I did a brief stint in Pittsburgh. My parents are divorced, and my dad lived out there for a long time, and so I would go out and live with him on occasion during the holidays and in the summertime and things like that. So I've spent quite a bit of my life between Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana for school. Each place is very different, despite being so close in proximity, and they have their own things to offer. Indiana was a great place to go to school because it was very kind. Like, it's a very gentle, almost like even more friendly than we are here in Ohio. It's quaint, it's adorable in a lot of ways, and it was just good for me because I was in such a fragile state. Like, just personally, I was in a fragile state, and it happened to be a very gentle state to live in. And I think that if I would have gone to school anywhere else, that I perhaps would have been swallowed up a little bit in trying to compete with other people, or just the general college mindset. Whereas here, like, people were very comfortable with me. They were very welcoming, and they let me into their lives and kind of ushered their way into mine. And so I was very much formed and shaped by people, and I found that a lot of my very good friends are from Indiana. I think that Ohio in general, as mentioned, it's basically where I got my start, how I was raised, and I think there are things here that are very, very apparent. Having some sort of manners, being friendly with people, kind of having a litmus test for how I deal with the world. I find that Columbus, where I live right now, is an interesting city because it attracts people from all over the place, and it's almost like a revolving door. We get all these very exotic people coming in, and then we have other people leaving to go do exotic things. And so sometimes I've met people here, like I had a friend I met from Argentina here in line at an ice cream shop, and he turns around and starts talking to me, and I'm like, oh, this is interesting. I'm going to talk to you. And we talked for several hours, and his wife comes over and meets me with their baby, and we hit it off really well. And he's like, you are the first person I've met where I've felt I can talk to them. In Argentina, people are so friendly, and here they're so cold. And I was just like struck by that as such a concept, because people come here from New York and they're like, I love everyone.
Right.
It's amazing. It's this interesting, like, almost moderate point for people, and just seeing where they come from. And it's helped me to understand people I've met here better. In terms of Pittsburgh, I feel like it's this old familiar kind of city where it kind of calls to me, and I don't know if it's calling from my roots, that it's very much built like an old world town. And I know this because I've been fortunate to go to Europe and have seen some of the houses built on the sides of hills, and the cars that are just kind of scrambling up and down it like ants on a jam jar. It's such a fascinating place filled with all this old charm and these beautiful old buildings that somebody has actually thought to continue using and to repurpose. And so I love that city because it's kind of a bastion of old things becoming new again, like almost like a rebirth. And the city itself is experiencing kind of a population boom and rebirth at this moment. So I think that's a highly appropriate notion for them. Yeah. I've been all over, and I've loved everywhere that I've been for different reasons. Definitely Indiana, the people and the mindset. Ohio as just like a touch point for other people. It's very much that standard, I guess. And maybe it's just because I know it. And
that's neat.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I love this area.
And you are an international traveler with your work, isn't that right?
Yeah, I am.
That's so cool.
It's really odd to say that.
That's so cool. So what have you learned from your experiences in other countries with your work?
Oh my goodness.
Just a few things, maybe, things that stand out to you.
Yeah. I have learned that our food standards are very lax here. very, very lax. On top of I've kind of become this self-actualized foodie where I loved food but didn't realize how much I loved it until I started doing this job. But it's fascinating. Part of why I get hired to go places that are not here is because people are so impressed that I make the food look appetizing, but it's not doctored in any way that's not natural. Like, I really strongly want to use the actual food forms as my pieces. And I guess here, you know, we're willing to throw like boot polish on a burger and do all this crazy stuff. And in some places, for example, like Canada is a big one, they're not allowed to do anything to their food. It has to be exactly as it's served. There's this very famous court case that one of the stylists was telling me about on a job up there. She said that Campbell's was sued because somebody had found out that food stylists stuck marbles in the bottom of soup bowls to raise the particulates in the soup so that you could actually tell it had chicken and vegetables and things in it. And it was a very common practice. Everyone was aware of it, but it wasn't publicly known. And once it got out to the public, somebody sued them and won because they're like, of course there are no marbles in here. So now they have to have 3 times the amount of particulates that they use to show these soups, but they can't show all of it because if they show all of it and it looks like there's too much, they can get sued for assuming that, you know, there's too much in the soup.
Wow.
So it's just this crazy concept, you know.
That's interesting. I'd never thought about how the way you use the food would affect the product sales of that food because you know, I mean, obviously you see like you say, you see boot polish on a burger and you're like, that doesn't look real.
Right.
But I'd never thought about it on the positive side of like, well, but if we put too much good stuff in here to take a good picture, then we can't sell it because it's too much product for people.
Yeah, exactly. And it's fascinating because for me, the idea of boot polish on a burger and hairspray on salad, it was a given. Like, that's just what we do. But I realized that not everybody else does that. We are very much into idealized shopping. And of course, we get this burger and it looks like the bottom of an actual shoe. But we don't care if it doesn't look like the image, whereas they care very much that everything is properly represented. And I thought that was very interesting and spoke to the difference in our values being so close to each other. We're obviously different in many ways.
Yeah.
And also just the human relations aspect of travel. I did some work in Dublin this past year and was really excited to go that far to do some of this work in person. And being there, it was fascinating. I learned that dad humor is basically the standard humor. That was a fascinating concept. Sexual innuendo is very commonplace in the workplace. I was really surprised by that. And I guess the city is very homogeneously white. And so therefore, like, any mention and like just telling them that my sister-in-law was from Ghana almost made everyone kind of like prickle up on it. Wow. Like, they didn't know what to do with it. They're like, oh, what is she telling us? Where is this going? Like, you know, it was just very odd because I live in a very heterogeneous area with lots of diversity and lots of different ethnic groups. And so speaking on those sort of subjects is just like, oh yeah, there they are. Hello. Surprise, we're all together here. But it was just fascinating, like, learning that about another culture and seeing like, oh, they're on an island, like, there are no people of other ethnicities here. It's very, very few. And so their reference point for this is very, very limited. It's fascinating. I've loved travel. I feel like it opens my eyes to not only how I perceive the world, but how everybody around me has been taught to perceive the world. Yeah. And seeing that there is such a broad expression for how people can live. Like, I'm fascinated that there are people who, in my humble opinion, are like on fire in a ball of flames, and yet they still exist. Yeah. And they're existing well. It's crazy. Crazy.
No, that's really neat. So within your trade, you use the term food typography, but you also mentioned food stylists and so forth. Do you feel like you have a lot of competition in the work that you're doing, or is it a pretty narrow market, or do you get into like the advertising, or could you just, I mean, kind of briefly describe the difference between people who do it for, like you say, the Campbell soup or whatever, but then you're doing some professional marketing also, and then you do a lot of it just as artwork, correct? So how does that correlate as far as the sort of competitiveness within that field?
It's a very small niche, which is really nice, or niche, depending on.
No, it's niche. It's niche.
Midwest niche, please. Yes, thank you.
Sorry, I feel strongly about that.
No, it's a very, very small niche, and I'm happy to have kind of cornered that market. It's very much a blend of illustration and design, styling, photography, because the photography is the vehicle for the work. No one would know it existed unless I could take an appropriate photo of it.
Yeah.
And so the photo itself has to be decent. I enjoyed photography in school. I was very attracted to it, but not to the sticker price, because it's always insanely expensive, and it's based solely in hardware. So it's like, oh no, how do I secure this hardware? It's so expensive. I'll make a box and a pinhole and figure this out. But it's fascinating, because at one point this past year, I had experimented with becoming more of a stylist, or marketing myself that way. And I learned that being a stylist, like a food stylist, is essentially like a bitch job. Nobody treats you with respect. First of all, you get paid very marginally by comparison. You're invited into the process after all of the decisions have been made conceptually on the piece. And so at that point, it's like, well, wait a second, that's the wrong spot for me. My role is technically more of an art direction role. And so therefore, I should be involved in the discussion. I should be involved in the concept and conceiving it. And I should be brought on before the photographer shows up. Usually when a photographer tries to source me, I know that it's likely I will not end up with the job, because at that point they're looking for the wrong person. They're looking for someone to execute a piece of meat or a pie. And that is part of my skill set. And I tell people that's part of my skill set, but really I'm offering a little bit more than that.
Yeah.
And so, that's been an interesting distinction to make this year. And it's been a little bit of a struggle, because I've lost work having to explain myself and then go, hey, I'm really sorry. It seems like I'm not right for this anymore.
Oh, wow.
So, it's a very interesting thought. As far as the idea of like food typography, it's basically a misnomer. Technically, this is lettering, because it doesn't follow a font, or it doesn't in any way create strict font guidelines. It's not really reproducible. But in order to get some sort of broader reach with my audience, I figured more people would understand the word typography than they would lettering. It's a larger community and appeals to the design community as well as other people outside of it. So that is why I named typography essentially the way that I have. But it's fascinating. And I found that as I've been doing this, people are impressed with like the fact that I choose new material every time. And so I'm not just working in pulverized substances or spaghetti or mashed potatoes or whatever. I've tried a lot of different things. And because of that, people are willing to approach me with non-food related items. And so I've been using a lot of physical and dimensional type objects like paper and plants. I did that recently.
Oh, wow.
Sheets. I've had people approach me to light paint. I've always wanted to do it, and it just never worked out with the schedule. But the fact that someone sees my thought process and goes, that person is hardworking, they're up for a challenge, and they will try anything until it's right, that makes them want to approach me with these new concepts. And I'm so excited about those. Those are my favorite kind of job proposals.
And what about like competition? Like people who even like infringe kind of on your like aggressive competition, like over the line kind of competition?
Oh man, there are a handful of those. And it is in fact, it is a huge compliment, because I never thought I would have work that anyone would want to reproduce. Like I never ever saw that possibility for myself, and if you would have told me, I would have laughed at you. So it's interesting to see, but it is extremely frustrating. As mentioned before, there's this ironically misappropriated T.S. Eliot quote that talks about bad artists stealing. And
Right.
Yeah, one of the points to that often gets lopped off because it's too short to fit on a t-shirt is that immature artists take concepts that have been made by other people and they don't add anything to them. The mature artist is the one that borrows ideas from other people, but they turn it into something new so that it's different than it was before. And harkening back to that last point in our conversation of like, if art is a physical snapshot of your thought process at one point in time and somebody replicates it later, even if technically it's done better, it was your thought from however long ago. That thought is old and it's moving on to something new. And so that aspect is frustrating because my story is obviously like laden with tears and woe and all of this like despair. And it took me such a long time to arrive at these ideas. And even though these ideas themselves aren't inherently mine, like people have done this before me and they will continue to do it after I put it away and don't think of it anymore. There's still an aspect to my work that is characteristically me in the same way that you go look at oil paintings and you go, that's a Monet. And I know people who look like Monet, but it's not Monet.
Right.
It's a similar issue.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think in part, there's a need in all of us when we're trying to learn how to do work, where we have to prove to ourselves that we can do things. And so we'll try anything. And sometimes it looks like someone else's work. But then there's a point when we realize, I don't need to do everything. I need to do what I want to do, or I need to follow my own thought process in doing things. And that is kind of when we make the shift from, everything is possible to, I want certain things to be possible.
Sure.
And I think that's a distinction that not everybody is able to make. And I'm not sure if that takes like a higher form of self-awareness or what that is, but it's not super clear to everybody.
Yeah, well, and I think sometimes you just look around and you say, there really is nothing new under the sun. Like all the raw materials we have are the exact same things that we've had for a very long time, but it's what we bring to the table. It's the growing up in the blue collar town. It's the gallons of chocolate milk we drank. It's the, whatever, whatever you bring to the table is what ultimately, when you take those same materials, I could take a bowl of rice and try and do something unique. And the only reason it would be unique from what I bring to it, from what you bring to it, is we're using the same rice, but it's my experiences or my skill with being able to, or in this case, lack of skill, being able to do any lettering or typography with it would be, apparent, because that would be a piece that I bring to it. And that's what makes it art, and that's what makes it unique, and that's what makes it the creativity. Like I love that aspect of it because yeah, you know what? I can go buy a camera and take pictures the same as someone else, but when one of our guests, Christian Gideon, picks up a camera and takes a picture, he brings something that's so beautiful and unique to it because he's had all this time to just develop his particular area of the craft. And that's what I love most about these, like we talked earlier about someone who's traditionally creative versus someone who does something that is just very expressive in their creativity. You roll up all your experiences and you bring it all to the table, and that's what makes it unique. And so that's encouraging to everybody. And so if you were to look back and talk to your younger self and say, like kind of that, you can do it. Just hold to your guns, and keep chasing it. Don't worry about the price of a camera or whatever else. I mean, have you thought about that? Like, what would I guess you are kind of in the way that you speak to other people and you say, you're wanting people to, you're kind of like paying it forward a little bit and helping them with their beginning. But if you were looking back, what would you say to someone who was starting kind of where you started or trying to make it to that next hurdle?
Oh, I see. Oh man, that one's difficult because I try to kind of, as I'm talking to people, figure out where they fall in this line of like where it took me, like where I was and the thought processes that it took me to get to where I am now. And it's not to say that everybody will follow a path that I have made, because obviously everyone can.
Right.
Everyone can find success or what they believe to be a measure of success in various ways. Well, if I was speaking directly to myself, I would say you should not have worn that sparkly blue top past like 4th grade, so put that away. But besides that,
amazing.
And I would encourage myself to find that balance of like not taking my work so seriously and having fun with it. I found that that was a big shift for me as well, is realizing that like while my work was super important to me, people weren't going to find it very important to them. And once I kind of had that realization of I'm a drop in a bucket, it essentially freed me up to be comfortable to explore and to be like, well, how can I make this drop in the bucket a little bit more meaningful than the last one? I think that it's important to try a lot of things. And oftentimes we get really excited about chasing our passions. Like, that's such a buzzword right now. But for me, I was always frustrated by that phrase because I didn't know what my passion was. I knew that I was interested in drawing and I knew I was interested in design, but I didn't know how either of those fit together. Yeah. And I didn't know with what subject matter and what kind of vehicle that work would require. And so for me, I found that, like, by doing a bunch of stuff, I did identities and logos, and I played around with, like, nice printing or unusual printing, and I couldn't find what I liked, but I knew what I didn't. And I think that sometimes that can almost be more helpful because you're less inclined to get stuck somewhere that we're okay with. You know, like, I can handle this. It's almost like you kind of start funneling yourself into an obvious category. You just don't know what that category is yet.
You know, I can't think of a better way to wrap that up than what you just said. So, I mean, it's been such a pleasure talking to you, Danielle. We've so appreciated you making time for us and telling us so many details that we wouldn't normally get, you know, at a conference or by just looking at your work. But I do, you know, I hope people check it out because it is really unique, and the flavor you bring to this is just so cool. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you both. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you can get to know Danielle by visiting marmaladeblue.com, and you can see some of her beautiful work there. You can also follow her on Twitter at marmaladeblue. And you can also learn more about this show by visiting spiritofthemidwest.net. Thanks for tuning in. Please join us next time as we celebrate the spirit of the Midwest.
I wanna show